At just 15 years old, Lorraine Thorp shocked the nation by becoming one of the youngest female double murderers in British history. Her involvement in the brutal killings of her own father, Desmond Thorp, and a vulnerable woman, Rosalind Hunt, sent shockwaves through the UK. But what makes this case even more chilling is the disturbing influence of a much older man, Paul Clark, who manipulated Lorraine into a life of violence, chaos, and death. How did a young girl, once the victim of neglect and abuse, become capable of such unspeakable acts? The answers lie in a dark and twisted story of manipulation, desperation, and the terrifying transformation of Lorraine into a cold-blooded killer. On August 10, 2009, the UK was shaken by the arrest of 15-year-old Lorraine Thorp and 30-something Paul Clark, two individuals charged with the brutal murders of two people, Lorraine's own father, Desmond Thorp, and Rosalind Hunt, a woman who had once tried to protect Lorraine from a life of violence. The case quickly captured public attention, not only for the severity of the murders but also because of Lorraine's age. At just 15 years old, she was on the brink of becoming the youngest female double murderer in British history. This shocking story of a teenager deeply entrenched in a world of crime, violence, and manipulation begged the question, how could a young girl end up involved in such heinous acts? Was she a victim of circumstance, or was she an active participant in this darkness? As the details of the case unfolded, they revealed a chilling story of abuse, neglect, and a devastating descent into violence. The story of Lorraine's life leading up to the murders was one marked by instability. She had a chaotic and dysfunctional upbringing. Her parents, both alcoholics, were neglectful and unable to provide the care and guidance a young child needs. Lorraine's early years were devoid of the love and protection necessary for healthy emotional development. Bounced between children's homes and living with various relatives, Lorraine's sense of security was shattered from the beginning. The lack of consistent nurturing in her formative years left her vulnerable, with no foundation for understanding what healthy relationships or appropriate behavior looked like. She found herself in a cycle of neglect that would follow her into adolescence. Her upbringing left Lorraine isolated, turning to substances like alcohol to cope with the trauma. But it wasn't just substances that filled the emptiness inside her. Paul Clark, a much older man, entered her life and took advantage of her vulnerability. He offered Lorraine a twisted form of affection and attention. At first, it may have seemed like a lifeline to Lorraine, someone who had never truly been cared for. But as she became more involved with Clark, it became clear that he was using her for his own manipulative purposes. This dangerous relationship allowed him to isolate Lorraine from others, trapping her in a world of crime, alcohol, and violence. Clark's influence over Lorraine became undeniable as he manipulated her into believing she was powerless without him. Lorraine's behavior increasingly reflected Clark's violent tendencies, and she became accustomed to the cruelty and callousness of their lifestyle. Lorraine's emotional and psychological state deteriorated, driven by Clark's control and a sense of dependency on him. Her exposure to this toxic environment further pushed her away from any potential support system, leaving her more deeply entrenched in the darkness. Lorraine Thorp's tragic journey into the world of violence and crime didn't start overnight. It was a slow, creeping process shaped by the neglect she faced in her early years. The psychological and emotional neglect from her family, coupled with the absence of any stable role models, made her vulnerable to exploitation by predatory figures like Paul Clark. Her parents, who were more interested in their own alcoholic indulgences, were completely uninterested in offering Lorraine the emotional support she needed. This neglect contributed significantly to Lorraine's downward spiral into a life of crime and brutality. When Lorraine was placed in a children's home, she would frequently run away, returning to her family where the chaotic lifestyle would continue. There was little stability or care in her environment, which made it difficult for her to develop a sense of safety and security. Without proper emotional nurturing or guidance, Lorraine's self-worth and ability to make sound decisions were compromised. Her behavior became more erratic, and her ability to form healthy relationships deteriorated. She was trapped in a cycle of neglect and turmoil. As Lorraine entered her teens, the combination of neglect and isolation made her increasingly susceptible to the influence of older men, particularly Paul Clark. Clark preyed on Lorraine's vulnerability, offering her a twisted sense of affection and protection. In many ways, he became a father figure to her, filling a void she had long felt. But this false sense of security would come at a steep price. Clark's manipulation was both emotional and psychological, and Lorraine became his pawn in a series of violent acts. Clark introduced Lorraine to a world that was vastly different from the life she had known. Together they drank, partied, and engaged in criminal activities. Lorraine, starved for attention and validation, quickly became attached to Clark, viewing him as her protector and the one person who truly cared for her. This manipulation went beyond simple affection. Clark sought to control every aspect of Lorraine's life. He ensured that she was completely isolated from any potential outside support, reinforcing her dependency on him. At this point, Lorraine's personality and actions began to mirror Clark's violent tendencies. She became desensitized to violence and began to enjoy the power and control that came with it. Her sense of right and wrong was warped, and she found herself in a dangerous relationship that would ultimately have devastating consequences. The tragic murder of Rosalind Hunt marked a turning point in Lorraine's descent into violence. Rosalind, a kind-hearted woman who had previously attempted to help Lorraine, became a target of Lorraine's newfound ruthlessness. Rosalind had expressed concern for Lorraine's well-being, especially after Lorraine had run away from home. Rosalind attempted to offer a safe space for Lorraine, but this act of kindness would come at a devastating cost. On August 2nd, 2009, Rosalind was violently attacked by Lorraine and Paul Clark. The details of the attack were horrifying. Lorraine and Clark's brutality towards Rosalind left her body battered and bruised. The violence was so extreme that it shocked everyone who heard about it. Witnesses testified that Lorraine was not just a passive observer but an active participant in the brutal assault. At one point, the attackers shouted at Rosalind, threatening to kill her. The sadistic nature of the attack suggested that this was not simply an outburst of rage, it was an intentional act of cruelty. What made the murder even more chilling was Lorraine's apparent lack of remorse. The young girl who had once been the recipient of kindness from Rosalind now seemed to take pleasure in the violence. Her involvement in the murder went beyond any sense of survival or self-preservation. It appeared as though she enjoyed the chaos and brutality. The shocking nature of this murder would leave the community in disbelief, especially considering Lorraine's age. The motive for the murder was initially unclear, but as the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that Lorraine's actions were tied to her fear of losing control over her life. Rosalind had threatened to report Lorraine's whereabouts to social services, potentially ending the manipulative relationship she had with Paul Clark. Lorraine, terrified of losing this toxic but familiar connection, lashed out. The combination of fear, anger, and the influence of Clark pushed Lorraine to commit the unthinkable. After the murder of Rosalind, Lorraine and Paul Clark's violent rampage continued. Lorraine's own father, Desmond Thorp, became the next victim. Desmond, a man ravaged by alcohol abuse, was physically frail and in poor health. Despite this, Lorraine and Clark decided to kill him, a decision that would shock the public even more. Desmond had been a passive figure in Lorraine's life, largely absent due to his alcoholism. He had been a victim of his own demons, unable to provide the care and support his daughter needed. At first, Lorraine and Clark claimed that Desmond had died in his sleep, choking on his own vomit. However, the post-mortem revealed a different story. Desmond had been smothered. The evidence pointed to a deliberate act of violence. Desmond's lips showed signs of being pressed forcefully against his teeth, indicating that someone had intentionally suffocated him. This revelation added another layer of horror to the case. The chilling detail that Lorraine had been involved in her father's murder was difficult to comprehend. How could a young girl, who had been a victim of neglect and abuse herself, turn on her own father in such a cold and calculating way? The answer lies in Lorraine's twisted relationship with Paul Clark. Clark had convinced Lorraine that Desmond was a threat to their criminal activities, and she was ultimately willing to eliminate him in order to maintain her violent lifestyle. Further complicating the case, a witness later testified that Lorraine had admitted to killing her father. She claimed that Desmond was about to reveal Rosalind's murder to the police, a secret that could expose both her and Clark. Lorraine, in a fit of rage and fear, decided that Desmond had to die. This chilling revelation painted a picture of a young girl who was no longer the innocent child she had once been. She had become a killer, just like the man who controlled her. The trial of Lorraine Thorp and Paul Clark in 2010 was a spectacle that captured the attention of the entire UK. The details of the murders were so horrific that they seemed almost beyond belief. The case raised questions about Lorraine's role in the killings and whether she could be held fully accountable for her actions. Could a 15-year-old girl really be responsible for two brutal murders? What role did Paul Clark play in her transformation into a killer? During the trial, Lorraine's behavior was unsettling. She displayed little to no emotion as the details of the murders were read aloud in court. Witnesses testified that she laughed and giggled during proceedings, which further horrified the public. Some even speculated that Lorraine had become desensitized to violence, no longer able to distinguish between right and wrong. The courtroom was filled with tension as the jury struggled to understand how a young girl could commit such heinous acts. In the trial, Lorraine Thorp and Paul Clark, both individuals were sentenced for their involvement in the brutal murders of Rosalind Hunt and Desmond Thorp. Lorraine, despite her young age and troubled upbringing, was sentenced to a minimum of 14 years in prison for the murders. The judge acknowledged the manipulative influence of Paul Clark on Lorraine, but also emphasized that, despite her age and chaotic background, Lorraine had demonstrated an understanding of her actions and had willingly participated in the violence. The sentence raised many questions about the rehabilitation of young offenders, especially given that Lorraine was only 15 at the time of the murders. While some believed she could potentially be rehabilitated after serving her sentence, others felt her actions were too brutal to be forgiven. The fact that she had shown little remorse, even laughing during her trial, made it difficult for the public to grasp the possibility of her rehabilitation. Paul Clark, on the other hand, was sentenced to a minimum of 27 years in prison for his role in the murders. Unlike Lorraine, Clark's sentence was considerably longer due to his more direct involvement and the fact that he had acted as the orchestrator of the violent acts. He had been a bully and manipulator within the local drinking community, and his control over Lorraine was seen as a significant factor in her descent into violence. Despite his attempts to deny any wrongdoing, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was held accountable for the deaths of both Rosalind and Desmond. In 2014, a disturbing development occurred. Paul Clark was found unresponsive in his prison cell, with a ligature around his neck. His death was ruled a suicide, though many felt it was a cowardly escape from facing the consequences of his actions. Clark had been serving his sentence for just a few years when he took his own life. Some viewed his death as an unfortunate end to a man who had caused so much pain and suffering, while others felt that it was a way for him to avoid the years of punishment he deserved.